Hello, my name is Matthew Ong, and I'm a postdoc researcher in Assyriology at the University of Helsinki's Center for Excellence in First Millennium Empires. My work there is ending shortly, and I'd like to make a video responding to something I recently saw on YouTube on a channel called the Canadian Jewish News, with an interview with one Adam Louis-Klein. In a video stated, How Anti-Zionism Emerged as a Modern Ideology. I'd like to argue that his argument actually is very flawed, and in fact represents ultimately just a kind of superficial defense or apology for Israel's apartheid state, its ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinians, and in fact is counterproductive to the very thing that he wants to happen, namely creating a world that is generally safer for Jews and that reduces the overall hatred, I guess, or animosity to Jews or Israelis. I should mention that I don't know much about Adam besides what the interview provides, namely that he is a PhD student in anthropology at the University of McGill, and that his PhD work is related to the topic that he spoke about in the interview. So I'd like to argue that what Adam is arguing about anti-Zionism as a kind of irrational hatred what it requires us to do is to decontextualize and forget the real reason why so many people around the world are justifiably angry at Israel, at Israelis, at Zionists in general. It takes away the fact that the injustices that are being committed there, its apartheid state, the ethnic cleansing, the genocide, the Western support of these institutions, the way that the state was founded by the particular founders of the state, these are much deeper injustices which asymmetrically drive the anger which, let's call them prototypical anti-Zionists, say and think. I'm not talking about the non-prototypical call them non-prototypical anti-Zionists. I'll get to that in a minute, because those are essentially just coming from the same wellspring of white supremacist anti-Semites who will always be there and who will always essentially take advantage of anything that is going on in the culture to promote their own racial supremacist views, their own bigotry and hatred. So I take Zionism to be those individuals who support the Israeli apartheid regime, its ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and the genocide which is going on. I take anti-Zionists to be the people who oppose that apartheid regime on the grounds of its fundamental injustice, an insult to human dignity, as well as the opposition to the ethnic cleansing and genocide which is still going on. And when I make this definition for anti-Zionists, I'm going to distinguish between two important categories. Let's call them prototypical anti-Zionists and the atypical or non-prototypical anti-Zionists. The non-prototypical anti-Zionists are essentially white supremacists who by their own means, for their own reasons, already believe that, say, WASPs or Western Europeans, white people, whatever, are the superior race, and that other people, in other words, including, say, faux Christian, white Christian fascism can be in the mix, and that they believe that other groups like Jews, Muslims, blacks, other minorities are inferior. The prototypical anti-Zionists run a wide gamut of people, but are not racially motivated in the same way. They are quite often Jews themselves, and their main beef with Israel and what it's doing is the fact that it is fundamentally unjust, period. That's important to distinguish. Now, I think it's important to keep these definitions and these categories in mind, because I think Adam is being a little bit too loose and careless in the way that he mixes these things. Although it is true that earlier forms of what we call Zionism in the 1800s there were great variety to them. They often reimagined Jewish identity in ways that are quite amazing to some of us and would in fact be regarded as heretical to many Israeli Jews in Israel, or Jews in general, I suppose, today. But that is not the relevant type of Zionism for today. The relevant type of Zionism to today is the one I just said. That is, those people who support Israel's apartheid regime, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, where that apartheid regime is essentially chauvinist, ethno-religiously motivated. Adam is not correct when he says that the state of Israel was founded according to Zionism just as he said it. Right? The more appropriate form of Zionism to point out for the founders of Israel is the so-called revisionist Zionism, guys like Jabotinsky, or or even guys like Ben-Gurion, who are all on the same page about their pretensions to be able to deal with the local people, both the Muslims, the Arabs there, right, Arab Muslims, but also, even in some sense, the Arab Christians, Palestinian Jews, the presumptions about the ability to move these people, to expel them, even essentially the value of their lives when it comes to killing them, and the legitimacy of establishing what is essentially viewed as an extension of Europe in the heartland of the Arab world. Those were crucial beliefs among the founders of the State of Israel. And you can go through any of the many historical presentations by people like Norman Finkelstein, Avi Shloam, Rashid Khalidi. These are all established facts. So it is disingenuous to present the foundation of the Israeli state as founded according to one of the other, let's call it minor or maybe more defensible, morally defensible forms of Zionism, when in fact it is this chauvinist one that was in the minds of the founders and the paramilitary wings, or sort of the form of strength, right, that early state had, regardless of how various European refugees who were persecuted and expelled unjustly from the homeland would have thought about the situation. Shortly after, Adam moves on to the issue of the stealing of food and how, as he argues, it is an irrational hatred or animus among anti-Zionists to point to Israelis and say, you're stealing food from the Palestinians because there's a discussion about the cultural transfer or appropriation, or however you want to say it, about the use of hummus in Israeli and Palestinian cultures. Well, I think really the more important point here is, once again, that the Israeli state is stealing food from the Gazans. They are starving them. And international food agencies, which send in relief, under essentially being limited in the amount of food aid they should be able to send in, ISIS-run bands, or bands ultimately with fealty to the Israeli state, are stealing a portion of that food. The Israeli population overall is feasting high and mighty while they lock up a bunch of people in a concrete jungle and starve them because they want them out, one way or another. That's what people are angry about, and they're justified in that. And if it happens to be that some issue about on the street about some hummus, right, involving Israelis, that on the surface might seem to just to be about cultural history, actually makes people angry, well, those people have a damn right to be angry. And Israelis should make it very clear that they abhor those policies of their government. But again, according to opinion polls, the majority of them have no problem with it. If you want to argue they don't know about it, well, there's only a certain amount to which that kind of argument can go, because it is pretty clear that most Israelis know, they have a general idea of the barbarity that their government and military or paramilitary wings and illegal settlers are exercising upon the population. If they have a general idea of that and they approve of it, why would they suddenly change their mind if they are suddenly informed, oh, an additional thing that their government and military is doing is starving them? Do you really think that they would change their minds? I don't. When Adam speaks about the genocide libel, there is a logical fallacy, or just notice a slip of argument that he makes. He observes how the Soviet Union in the 70s used the genocide libel, how in the past, at least as far as I understand it, he's saying that in the past in medieval Europe, of course, genocide libels were used horribly to persecute medieval European Jews. And then he now suddenly switches to how, after October 7th, the libel is still being used here. But the problem with this is that since October 7th, the Israeli state has been committing a genocide. And here, of course, we don't need to get into all of the minutiae about the arguments, but really the International Court of Justice has essentially made a ruling about that. International scholars of the Holocaust, of genocide, have actually come out and said, yes, this is pretty much a genocide. And even if you want to be very technical and say, or rather what I should say is sort of come up with other arguments, say, this isn't a genocide, right? Well, it's pretty clear that's a pretty damn large, massive slaughter. It is one in which the Israeli state doesn't care how many people they kill. The goal is to get them out of that land, so they will kill as many to make them want to leave. And if they have to do kill every single one, then they ultimately will. That's the point. So after October 7th, this is a truth. And of course, that is the sadness of Zionism, and the sadness that has essentially crept into and ultimately just ruined the current state of Israel. That is, so to speak, the persecuted have become the persecutors. The kinds of treatment and behavior that medieval, either early modern or European Jews were subjected to is now being replicated by the Israeli state upon the Palestinians. The kinds of stereotypes, the false myths, generalizations, or whatever you want to call them, right, the anti-Semitic tropes, are to some degree now being realized by the state of Israel or the broader allies of this project. So no, let's just think carefully about what the truths are and what he's saying. There really is a genocide going on. That is an appropriate label. The people, when they realize this, are justifiably angry. And yes, they have an appropriate attitude in being very angry or hating the people who either conduct that genocide directly, who abet it, or seem to not care about it when they have the ability to do something about it. Now, there is, I have to admit, a quite ridiculous point being made in the interview where Adam argues that anti-Zionism is essentially driving the wars against Israel and that it is harming both Jews, Palestinians, and other groups alike. He makes the statement that essentially it is anti-Zionism that has been driving the, quote, wars against Israel. But if he's referring to basically the general history of the Israeli state in the Middle East and what are formally called wars in the history books, it's actually the opposite. There has never been a war in the history books that Israel has fought in which Israel did it for what we would call honest self-defense. In each one of those wars, whether it is 48, partially, I'll get to that in a moment, the 67 war, the Six-Day War, invasion of Lebanon in the 80s, 2006 Lebanon, right? The 12-Day War with Iran. In each one of those cases, Israel chose to commit the instigating or the definitive provocation and hostilities in order to seize more land, in order to punish, beat down opposing forces when they had another choice, when they could have essentially opted for negotiation, de-escalation in what could be argued, in fact, a defensive measure. That has never happened. And if you want to see proof of this, all you need to go is through the standard historical sources and the opinions of the experts. Again, Eli Pape, Norman Finkelstein. 48 war, of course, well, of course, this really shouldn't be that surprising to people who actually understand the issue. But if you look at how would we imagine any group of people to react? How would we imagine to react if, say, the Chinese government decided now to essentially establish a colony of Uyghurs in the Israeli state, did not really care about the fundamental rights of Israelis, decided to drive them out, decided to kill people who resisted. They had a sort of nationalist myth. And the Israelis, quite understandably, said, no way, man. We don't want to leave. We will resist you. And so if this were done, say, in the central Tel Aviv area, the other cities, the other parts of Israel, if they said, hey, we don't like this happening to the people living in Tel Aviv, let's get these people out. We regard this as an affront to us. It's not because they hate Uyghurs. It's because they hate the people invading and trying to dominate their territory. They don't have the Israelis, in this case today, the Israelis today, just like the Palestinians or the other Arabs and Muslims of the region back then, did not have a crystal ball. They didn't know that this presence of the state, which they don't like, would continue to endure under one of the most powerful militaries of the world, that it would become important for them to make their case to the international world, to speak the language of modern Western secular liberalism, to understand that, in fact, they would not have a chance, given the power dynamic, if they continue to simply speak terms, other religious terms, other ways of thinking about people. And in other words, that they would have to actually accept the presence, to some degree, of this state, right? They don't have a crystal ball to know that. In other words, we could understand, even if not fully supporting, the animosity of those surrounding areas, given that the central state itself had decided from the beginning that it was going to be hostile, it was going to be different. Its way of interacting with its neighbors was going to be premised on domination and intimidation, because it would always require the support of a major external power. Right? That's in 48. And of course, we already know that the leaders of the state, even if low-level soldiers or other citizens were not on board or informed with it, that they really did intend to go beyond the very borders that had been assigned to them in the 47-48 partition. They really did lie and were not genuine when they signed that agreement, and that's what they did under Plan Dalet. So if I can just summarize once again, this idea that anti-Zionism is driving wars which Israel didn't want is just wrong. It's simply repackaging the old talking points of the Zionists, where you replace the word anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. Because I strongly, really, if you can hopefully anticipate where these arguments of mine are going, I think Adam is fundamentally confused. And he really does think Zionism is the same as Judaism. He just can't argue that anymore now, so he'll use different terminology. Now, there's a very telling argument that Adam makes shortly thereafter about how anti-Zionism is kind of this force that unites, let's say, Muslims in the Middle East and drives them to sort of seek the annihilation and the destruction of Israeli Jews there, and that Arab governments have misused this belief system, I guess, as he would put it, to shield themselves from their own mismanagement, their own failures. But this is, in fact, quite a telling argument that Adam makes and really shows, I think, where he's kind of coming from. The first fact I think that should be noted is that these governments in the Middle East Arab world, Middle East in general, they are, in fact, in general, right, far more friendly to the Israeli state, to the Israeli apartheid project, to its genocide, than the population. Now, perhaps there are examples in the past, say the 20th, 19th century, I guess, of Arab leaders, Muslim state leaders, using this as a way to distract them. I wish he would be specific, but the general fact still is those states are far more Zionist than anti-Zionist. To such a degree, of course, that, well, even people on the street kind of understand. They may not understand very much about Middle Eastern politics, but they probably now do understand. The Gulf state leaders are essentially puppets of Washington, and that they act to the preference or in cooperation with Israel on serious, in promoting essentially or abetting serious moral issues, moral injustices, so that they continue to rule. They know, of course, that the way to be rulers in their own countries goes through Tel Aviv and ultimately to Washington, where it is their population which understands the oppression and the violence that the Palestinians are going through, and they don't like their own governments. So really, in general, the trend works far the other way, and that is far more telling about how we should think about anti-Zionism versus Zionism. The governments are far more Zionist. And, of course, we must address this issue about how anti-Zionism supposedly unites the vast majority, or the Muslims and Arabs in the Middle East to seek the annihilation of the state. Well, once again, this is just another talking point, right? If you look at what most of these people believe, if you look at even, say, the official positions of practically, as far as I can tell, let's just say in general, right, the big players in the Middle East, how they think of Israel, even when, say, leaders or politicians in the past have said, we seek the destruction of Israel. What they really mean is they want the state gone. They want the apartheid state gone. They don't have a problem with another state that actually treats the people, the Palestinians, with dignity, with equal rights, or you might say some sort of segregated, right, two-state solution of some fairness or some combination. They really don't have a problem with that. Go look at what the Iranians say now. Go look at what, say, Egypt says, right? Go and talk to those people. If you say to them, would you be okay with, say, killing massive slaughter of Israelis in the way that the Israeli government, with essentially the support or condonement of the vast majority of its population, but not totality, have been treating the Palestinians? You ask them, would they be in favor of doing this to establish the Palestinian state? They would in general say no. The majority, right? Not the totality, probably. So they don't seek to massacre people. They are smarter than you think. And again, I'm sure that this is not really a new kind of argument, or that this kind of this kind of debate we've been having about how supposedly the uneducated or irrational masses of Muslims just hate Israelis, or really Jews, right, is supposedly the way the argument would go, hate them just for who they are, and that's where the problem is, right? This is really just a rehashing of the argument, and it just isn't true, right? We could even just really reduce it to the issue of the statements of the governments that seem to be able to control the actions of how they relate to other populations, in other words, and see, no, there is nothing like that. Hamas, no, they do not seek the annihilation of the Israeli population. They seek a Palestinian state that will replace the brutal apartheid state. Now, maybe we can argue about whether that is likely to happen, whether it's morally justifiable, but there is a significant difference. And of course, one way you can simply see this is, well, if you find that morally disturbing, why don't you find morally disturbing the official policy of the Likud party, which is, of course, to have a singular state only for the Jews, right? Which, in fact, it and every other major party in Israel has been effectively pursuing this policy, even the ones that don't officially say it, including, of course, the ruling Western elites who promote this kind of ethnic supremacy project. Why are we not hold them to the same standard and say, well, since you seek to only, I guess, have a state of a certain type, well, that means you don't get to, even if, say, the majority of your population elects you, you don't deserve to rule. You need to be hunted. You need to be charged as terrorism, killed, sidelined. We don't do this for the West. We don't do it for the practically every single Israeli administration. So there's quite a lot of hypocrisy going on here. Brief note, again, Adam speaks about how it is anti-Zionism that is, that although it, quote, may have some elements of truth, it is driving the, quote, ongoing wars against Israel. Well, this is, again, just very telling of how Adam thinks. Ongoing, Israel is starting and driving all of the wars in the Middle East that involve it. The unjustified and quite disgustingly deceptive attack on Iran, fiending negotiation over the nuclear program. And here, of course, although it is technically the United States that was supposed to conduct these negotiations, really the Israeli government and the US government were working in lockstep, as they have been for quite many years in the Middle East. The other, let's call them conflicts, right, where Hezbollah was attacking Israel. Well, that's obviously because Israel decided to start conducting the genocide. They said, the leaders of Hezbollah said quite clearly, stop the genocide, we'll stop firing on you. Same with the Yemenis. So really, and if, of course, if there were to be further action against Iran, no one would be so foolish to think, oh, this is really Iran's doing. No, of course, it is Israel's, because Israel cannot tolerate a pure competing power that will not bow down to its wishes as far as its treatment of the Palestinians and ultimately in the domination of the Middle East. And that is tied up, of course, with the desires of the neocons in Washington. And as I said before, all previous wars involving Israel in the Middle East, the ones that get called wars, right? Including, of course, the ones that don't get called wars, like the extreme massacre of Gazans in the 2000s under Operation Cast Lead and later on Protective Edge. Those were things that Israel decided to commit, not because it was under any meaningful sense of threat, because it needed to make an example of the Palestinians in Gaza who were becoming restless. They committed mass terrorism. The Israeli state committed mass terrorism in those examples. And of course, they had no right to lock the Gazans up in a concentration camp. The assumption that they had good intentions or that it had to happen is completely false. Any historian who knows the material will say that the Israeli state should have granted the Palestinians their own state, even under the very meager and hardly satisfying conditions of the 1967 borders, that is what they should have done, that they knew they could do that, and they chose not to, because, again, they had the backing of the world's most powerful military and economic empire behind them, and they became drunk on their own power, even as, in the other direction, of course, the neocons were in some sense using Israel to further their own dreams of domination in the Middle East. Now, at a certain point in the video, the interviewer herself actually talks a little bit and says that she supports the idea of Jewish self-determination, the idea of a Jewish state, and brings that into the idea of how anti-Zionism is frustrating these ideas. And once again, this idea has been hashed out, in detail, going way, way back. The question that one should always ask this particular woman is, well, what kind of state do you support? Do you support the ethno-supremacist apartheid state that has relations based on military dominance and intimidation rather than cooperation? Is that, well, in other words, the state you have now, is that the state you support? Or do you support a state that has equal rights for all? That is a true liberal democratic state? Do you support a theocratic ethno-supremacist state? Not just, right, one by sort of coincidence, but a true chauvinist one that, against the grain of the reality, the social demography, tries to create conditions by force and mass violence. Is that the state you support? If you put it that way, the choice is pretty clear. And if she says, well, it has to involve some of this apartheid business, some of this excessive violence, because, well, it's got to be there in the Middle East. Well, we can get into the whole question about, well, really, what is this about, right? I mean, how important it is that there be a state there? Is this about safety for Jews? This is about sort of a nationalist project, right? Any way you cut the pie, you're going to find that if you support anything like this current state, anything that has apartheid, anything that seeks to have a kind of demographic majority by force, it's going to be morally unjustifiable. So once again, let's get to the real issues at hand and start trying to cover one term with another in a kind of playing a double game here. Now, Adam makes a very telling line of argument shortly afterwards, dealing with how he thinks his new anti-Zionist movement would train people, I guess, to be better defenders of the state of Israel. And he says, well, they would train people in online situations how to respond to what he regards as harassment, bringing up a sort of situation in which there is, say, an Israeli or a Zionist who suddenly comes under attacks, right? Attacks in the sense of anti-Zionist, pointing out or saying in various ways facts about October 7th or denying claims about what happened on October 7th, involved about, say, Hannibal Directive, or I guess seemingly to deny that there were actual mass rapes or significant number of rapes of Israeli women by Gazans. So if I understand his argument correctly, he doesn't seem to actually know yet or care that there have been no substantive, there's been no real substantive proof that any mass rape happened by the Hamas forces or the Gazans in general on October 7th. That these stories which were circulated were either gullibly sucked up by the corporate media, by Israelis themselves, duplicitously fashioned, spun out of very, very tenuous evidence at all, and that this is in fact far more telling of the Israeli psyche, of the need to feel morally superior to people that they had come to believe to be, as Yoav Gallant said, subhuman animals, right? The Untermenschen, as Norman Finkelstein has said, that they needed some justification to convince themselves that they were still good people for either supporting the current or anticipated mass slaughter of Palestinians as a way of restoring deterrence, the sense of honor and shame. That is far more telling about the Israelis than whether any actual individual instances of rape happened. And of course we know that rape, that sexual violence, bodily mutilation has happened in non-trivial amounts in the detention camps, the prison, basically the prison cells and such, conducted by overseen by the Israeli military, and that most Israelis don't have a problem with this. That a significant part of the population actually cheers on this. And that the rest of the population, again, there is a small portion which is not, don't seem to be too disturbed by it. So let's just get the facts right? It doesn't seem that Adam understands the facts. The Hannibal Directive is true. It is a shameful part of Israeli society, particularly in light, right? I mean, particularly what makes it shameful is that it is something which is born of an oppressor society, you could call, right? A group which, on the one hand, quite honorably, right, understandably values the lives of its own people, but because they are oppressing another population which has no way really to fight back in any symmetric way to maintain their own rights and dignity, well, they might resort to hostage taking. And then in that case, because the Israeli government is far more committed to the ethno-supremacist and land-grabbing project, that they will choose to ultimately kill those citizens rather than negotiate for their release, right? Because they would cost so much more in doing that. I would also just say what kind of situation are we imagining here? What we know from experience online because of the such pervasive and strong Hasbarist program by the Israelis and Zionists right in the West, that it is far more likely that what would prompt talking about the Hannibal Directive, the lack of evidence for systematic rape, the pointing out the barbarities of the IDF in Gaza, or the sexual violence, bodily mutilation such visited on Palestinians, the much more likely environment in which those posts would be made by anti-Zionists is in response to a Zionist making ridiculous, inflammatory comments themselves, whether out of true ignorance, whether out of a desire to sort of just be iconoclastic and essentially be an asshole. That is far more the environment, rather than an innocent Israeli just saying, oh, here I am. Oh, wow, suddenly you guys are bringing up October 7th and talking about how the Hannibal Directive would, that is, a nasty thing, that there aren't any mass rapes going on. In fact, really, what that Israeli should do is simply say, hey, I don't support those things that the Israeli state does. I oppose the genocide. And in that case, the vast majority, practically all of those Zionists involved in that conversation would stop, right? There would be camaraderie and support among them between both sides to a certain level. So this idea that the anti-Zionists are just bringing up these very shameful facts about the state of Israel to ordinary Israelis walking around, well, there are two things to keep in mind, right? The vast majority of Israelis, but not totality, really do have no problem with that. So why would it be inappropriate to suddenly bring this up? Only, of course, if those Israelis secretly support those policies and have no way to defend themselves from the fact that they support them. Because, of course, if they didn't support those policies, the best, absolutely effective way to essentially diffuse the tension, right, to counter any sort of unjust assumption about what that Israeli believes is just to say what they should say, what they all should say, which is, I don't support the barbarities of my state. I don't support the Israeli apartheid regime and such. They could say, I don't agree with you about exactly how the future should proceed, but we're all on the same page about basic morality. This is something that Adam he doesn't take on, because of course he has no arguments for what he believes and what he understands most Zionists, or I would really say all Zionists, to believe. Shortly thereafter, Adam speaks about how his new movement would train people, they're providing a new defense of Zionism, I guess, of something, in light of the fact that the charge of anti-Semitism isn't being effective anymore. He says that, well, when Zionists are engaged, or as he puts it, accosted by anti-Zionists, the anti-Zionists will try to defend their views by saying, well, that's anti-Semitic, and then how that's not being effective, right? And now they have nothing left, and so they need something, right? And of course, what he suggests is say, you're anti-Zionist, and that's supposed to kind of carry the same kind of weight, engage the sign of, create the same kind of scene in the mind of people as being an anti-Semite. Well, come on, let's just think about this, right? The reason why anti-Semitism, the charge of anti-Semitism as something that the Zionists say in defense of their own views, the reason it's no longer working, right? The reason it isn't shutting people down, that isn't being regarded as the win in the argument, is because it was fallacious to begin with, and people now see through it, right? They know enough about the facts, and they are quite sick and tired of ignorant people, arrogant people, and yes, often those are Zionist Jews, using this, abusing that charge with the kind of important moral opprobrium that is generated, right, by the early modern period, to use this to defend their own indefensible beliefs, right? That's what he's upset about. He's simply trying to now replace one word with another. We were supposed to think about anti-Zionism in the same way we were thinking about anti-Semitism before decades ago. And it's not going to work, right? Because the facts are what the facts are. I'd like to summarize much of the rest of the video in which Adam argues for the need for his anti-Zionist movement in the sense that in which he says basically that anti-Zionism is seeping into the culture, that there needs to be a cultural change, that anti-Zionism is becoming more violent and will lead to more threats, violence visited upon Jews or Israelis, right, Israeli Jews, and essentially just summarize this as the same kind of ignorant position which Zionists have always taken, which is to say, we need to shut down the people calling out the problem, who are getting angrier and angrier that their proper and correct calling out and even, yes, hatred of people doing disgusting things is being ignored, is being crushed. They see their own democratic rights to control their own country being taken away. They see elite corruption feeding into what is going on in the maintaining the Israeli apartheid state, and the murder and the genocide, tying into other forms of grave social injustices like wealth inequality, Orientalism, of course, right? US neocon policies, how all of these things do tie together, and how the frustration that people feel, the inability of them to actually correct these injustices, will lead them to seek substitutes, right? Scapegoats, in other words. The more and more the level of injustice increases, and the ability of these people really, as a democratic majority, with well-balanced, quite strong arguments for what they believe, if that frustration continues, of course, it will spill over more. Adam's argument is really just the same that a lot of people who cannot really prioritize or at least recognize the fundamental moral priority of removing the offending source of injustice. He wants to shut down the messengers calling out the problem and growing desperate about it. If he does that, of course, he's simply committing two very grave injustices. One is to abet the injustice going on. Two, it ends up fundamentally destroying other democratic rights, other important aspects of a moral liberal society, as we have seen with the growing right of fascism, censorship, distortions and lies, rule by minority, prioritization of kind of ethnic, racially motivated violence, namely that white people get to do things, right? White Christian fascism and such. And of course, thirdly, of course, he will be acting against his own supposed priority, which is to make Jews feel safe, which is to promote peace, substantive peace, right, based on justice and facts. This doesn't mean, of course, that we should be blind to the ways that the growing frustration, the proper indignation of the majority of the world, especially in the West, to see their own leaders, people in positions of power, that yes, do include a Jewish billionaire class, as Norman Finkelstein has said, who are Zionist. To see these people wrenching away the last vestiges of democratic control, of resorting to ever greater levels of deception, burying themselves in ever greater levels of ignorance, to promote these kinds of unjust projects, that level, right, we should not be blind to that fact that that can spill over and lead to violence against innocent Jews. We've seen this in other places, like the Australian beach killings, yes, unjust, deplorable killings of a number of Jews in the West. I mean, I don't need to get into specific examples other than, of course, to realize that they've happened and they're important. It is stupid and duplicitous to make this the priority in the sense of saying, forget about the cause of all this, that is the Israeli apartheid state, its acts, its cooperation with ruling elites. That needs to be the thing that is shut down first, because a lot of the other arguments, the differences among people about what counts as true anti-Semitism, whose feelings are hurt, those can all be avoided, shut to the side, because there will be no instigating source of justified rage that gets certain people who defend those unjust projects into the business of splitting hairs, right? Not that splitting hairs is sometimes not important, but it can't be the fundamental issue here to the exclusion of the true offending evil. Just briefly, when Adam talks about how there is sort of a frenzy of inaccurate, as he would put, maybe anti-Zionist fueled libels, lies about Israel being put out. He says he has a computer full of these examples and how that needs to be addressed. I mean, really, if you look at how the corporate media, right? The duplicitous, untrustworthy corporate media, so heavily influenced by Hasbar's propaganda, but the Israeli lobby, right? It is deep into American corporate media. You'll see that really the vast majority of examples of journalistic distortion, runaway rumors really go in the other direction. Namely, it is about how certain, again, the stories say of New York Times, right, screams without words, a completely utterly disgusting example of faux journalism, which represents the lowest point to which New York Times has come. It is really in the other direction that stories are promoted, because in fact, the simple fact is, as a cultural phenomenon, so much of the West is swimming in these Hasbarist myths, distortions, right, going back decades. And it is only now, let's say in recent decades or even recent years, that the veil of these myths has been pulled apart, that people really are beginning to understand, even if in some crude terms, how Israel works now and are able to fill in the pieces of the puzzle going back about what probably happened in the past, right? We are now actually coming to a far more accurate understanding of what happened in the past, and that is not flattering towards the state of Israel or those who would defend its racial apartheid regime and project of ethnic cleansing. That's what's really going on far more. That is the thing that needs to be promoted, even if it is painful. I mean, Adam is fine. I mean, he can bring up examples of how runaway stories have happened about unfair attacks against Israel. But really, the fact is, the general direction of how the journalistic malpractice works is going to be far more indicative of Israel and the Zionist supporters rather than the other way around. So I'd just like to briefly touch upon this argument that Adam makes in regards to, say, Zoran Mahdani, and how anti-Zionism has sort of the language and the understanding of injustice in terms of colonialism, rights, apartheid, Western dominance, and how that is now just sort of taken for common sense among the vast majority of people, and that you don't have to know anything about Israel and still somehow believe that Israel is a genocidal, racial apartheid, chauvinist, ethno-supremacist state, and that this is unfair, right? Well, I mean, Adam, the fact is, Israel is a genocidal, unhinged, chauvinist, ethno-supremacist state going back decades, right? Take out the genocide part, but you still have a lot of that going back. That's what people recognize now. Before that, they didn't. And the Israel lobby had an easy time convincing people of how their own unsupported, that is unjustified, projects of ethnic cleansing, territorial acquisition, of silencing and shutting down people who dared to speak out. They used to have an easy time doing that, and now they don't. So if it seems like these words, colonialism, racial apartheid, genocide, and being associated with Israel, if that seems to be on the lips of everyone, that's because it's true. They understand it. They don't need to know anything about Israel in terms of the dates of the wars. What they see is what they see on television from now things that cannot be denied or distorted by the corporate media, by the Israel lobby, and by Zionists. And because of that, well, yeah, they don't need to know a lot. But one thing they do know is Israel's a bad place. And that's a fact. And your attempts to reverse this situation by going through some sort of mental gymnastics and complaining, well, you have ignorant people who the only thing they know about Israel is that it's engaging in genocide and ethnic supremacists. Well, honey, that's because that's what deserves to be known about it. Right? You should be one of the people that argues for getting rid of those institutions and stopping that evil. And then you might actually have a chance of arguing how Israel is being unfairly maligned, because right now it deserves that malignment. You are simply trying to argue away facts by using shadow arguments, and it isn't going to work. I think Adam's arguments really are unraveling towards the end of the interview when it gets to, say, the point of Bari Weiss, and he argues that the hatred towards Bari Weiss is because she's a successful rising Jew. I mean, this really is a pathetic argument. Bari Weiss is the epitome of anti-woke, faux right-wing intellectualism, right? She is a deep hypocrite. Adam knows, hopefully, that in her own college years, she was trying to dox, cancel, get fired Palestinian professors, or I guess we have to say Palestinian professors, who told her the truth about Israel and the history of that area, who told her uncomfortable things about what Zionists were doing. She tried to get them fired. And then, of course, later on, she complains about how she is being canceled. And now she is the czar of ZBS, right? Zionist Broadcasting System, engaged in her own sort of superficially credible, dignified form of journalism, which is really just a kind of corporate, right-wing, and yes, Zionist propaganda is easy to take down about her lies, about her superficial combination, I guess you could say, of diversity, liberal sexual values, and her complaints, the way that she dances around the substantive issues to which she's committed to most, which is, of course, yes, chauvinist Jewish supremacy, paleo-republicanism, that is neoliberalism, forms of hierarchy, social segregation. Yes, she is all those things. People aren't angry at her because she's Jewish. They're angry at her because she embodies disgusting attitudes, is another shill for Zionism, for the Israeli lobby, you could say. When the interviewer and Adam move on to the business of Albert Memmi and the arguments about, well, is Zionism European colonialism and who was in the land first and such, this is really nothing new. This is essentially just a rehash of Zionist arguments about saying, well, Jews were in the land first, so they were kicked out, they're coming back now, and the other people were sort of intermediate interlopers who can get by with getting out, or that they took over the place by force before, so the Jews, meaning European Jews, are simply just returning home, right? And this is really a repatriation effort. If you study any of the serious historians, you will know how fallacious this argument really is, right? I can summarize just a few points, understanding that this isn't really meant to be terribly, let's say, persuasive, but I think I can notice a few very important things. There has never been a point in the history of the Holy Land where Jews were the only, or even the vast majority of population between the river and the sea. It has always been the case that there have been a great number of non-Jews, or even, as we might say, non-Israelites, whether those were Greeks, whether those were other Semites before the arrival of Islam, whether those were other types of, I guess we would call them today Jews, but we might in the past call them Samaritans, people from the Southern Kingdom, right? They didn't agree with each other. They didn't see themselves as part of the same nationalist project. They didn't see themselves as having the same religious center, or really having much to do with each other on a friendly basis, at least as far as we were to think about their leaders, or Christians, or Muslims, or secular people who did not identify in any way. That's always been the case. It is a great fallacy, of course, to believe that the Jews do not have a substantive relationship to the land, and that we might summarize this by saying they have a claim to part of it. No one can deny this. What Zionists want is all of it, and they do so in ways which are incredibly arrogant, simplistic, and dismissive. There's never been a time when the entirety, or even the vast majority, of the Jewish population of the Holy Land has been expelled. The expulsions, at least if we are going after a point in which we can definitively speak about Jewish identity, that is, say, in the Second Temple period, right after 500 BC, there have indeed been very unjust, disgusting massacres and expulsions of the population from the district of Judea around Jerusalem. But other areas, say in the Roman period, around the Sea of Galilee, did have substantive communities, including many of the refugees from Judea in the Great Jewish War, or the Great Jewish Revolt. And it is from there, of course, that the very great beginnings of the Palestinian Talmudic tradition began, to say nothing of course, the Babylonian Talmudic tradition, which depended somewhat on its own in the East. So, again, no argument about how Jews have an important place, right? It's not about percentages, but let's just say, yes, quite a reasonably large claim to the part of the land. And yet at the same time, the Arab conquerors who came, right, they came roughly as a minority. And we know from demographic and genetic studies, historical studies, and ethnographic analogy that it is that the people basically of the Levant, modulo, yes, a few important changes over the 2.5 millennia up until now, that it is largely a matter of people changing their religion. And that really the population of, say, 1900, 1850 in the Levant, which did compose of a majority of Palestinian Muslims, Levantine Muslims, Palestinian Christians, Jews, and such, those really were just the remote descendants of the people going back to, say, the Roman period and earlier. And that in some terms, of course, those people are the true heirs of the legacy of the Kingdom of Judea, if you choose to see it this way. The Palestinian Christians and Jews and Muslims. So, yes, European, Western, Ashkenazi Jews, the white people, they really were part of a colonial effort. That's how they saw themselves. It's not that they had no connection to the land, but their connection to the land was less direct than those people there. And so really, there should be no true controversy about this idea that, I suppose, a well-meaning, kind of uncommitted, neutral person of the world would say, well, why can't they all just share the land between Christians, Jews, and Muslims? Or, if you want to put it another way, Israelis, Palestinians, some other group, or just the two between them. There is no reason why that shouldn't be. The problem is that the true group that is an obstacle to peace are the Zionists, because they want it all. They can't have half. They'll give you the reasons, saying it's unsafe, but to the degree that it has become unsafe now is because of what they supported in the past, when they did indeed know better, but they chose not to take that path. I'd like to summarize this video in this section, which was recorded later than the other sections, by summarizing my main point, which is essentially that I think that Adam is unjustifiably attempting to analogize the animus, the anger, even the hatred that anti-Zionists, prototypical anti-Zionists, as I define them, feel towards Israel or Israelis in general, to the other kinds of social animus and racism, bigotry that we know of, such as anti-black racism or homophobia, even the traditional anti-Semitism in early modern Europe and in the pre-modern period. And the problem with this is that the analogy is just not justified. In the case of anti-black racism, that is such, so to speak, if I can use the analogy of being dispersed through the input vectors for what causes it and how it arises in society, I suppose, are quite manifest. And more importantly, there just is no justification for believing it. The same with homophobia and traditional anti-Semitism. In the case of the anti-Zionists, there is a clear and direct cause, which is what Israel is doing now, especially, but in the past. It's driving Zionist ideology and how most Israelis really do subscribe to that. That's the main difference. There is just a clear input source. And it's clear, as so many of the historians and sociologists have argued, that if you resolve that point, then pretty much all of the animus, so to speak, in prototypical anti-Zionism will vanish, right? Because it is predicated on resolving the injustice and the anger which comes from seeing those attempts being frustrated by institutions of power, leaders, people with lots of money, people who are willing to corrupt democratic institutions, engaging in censorship, engaging in violence, engaging in narrative distortions, institutions and people who claim to represent liberal values or to hold a moral high ground being corrupted, perhaps in some ways according to understandable human foibles, but still being wrong nevertheless. And in that sense, it's not terribly different from other social justice struggles, South African apartheid or the 1960s with black enfranchisement, right? There are similar dynamics there. So let's not do this, right? In other words, what Adam wants to do is cut out the crucial background condition, right? And in that about Israel, how it is driving people up the wall about how they can't come to common sense, if perhaps unpleasant in the eyes of the chauvinist Jewish supremacists, means to stop the violence and come to some reasonable accommodation there. And again, even if it rubs Zionists the wrong way in terms of what they think deserves to happen there, that doesn't mean that that is the fair or the necessary thing that should happen. When Adam says, well, his anti-anti-Zionist movement is a little bit like the black man using the N-word, right? That he's proudly kind of embracing the Zionism. Well, no, Adam, you are not in the position of the black man. You are in the position of the white Karen, who is complaining about how a lot of either black people or some of their anti-racist white allies are pointing attention to deep, unresolved problems regarding racism and how poor black people are being treated. That's the better analogy. And so the whole program, I think, is really just a rehash of traditional Zionist apologists to direct people's attention away from the real problem and onto the messenger, and getting us to normalize the crimes and injustices that are going on in Palestine or in the actions of the Zionist actors elsewhere in the world, so that we can now try to deal with the ineluctable psychological issues about animus and hatred. Because if you do that, well then yeah, I guess you actually can sort of bring a lot of criticism to people who say hateful things and get angry. But remember, that anger, that hatred, as long as it is indeed within a certain reasonable sphere of action and how it works, right? Which is indeed what characterizes the vast amount of what anti-Zionists, in the form of activists, ordinary people in the street, are doing. We can't forget what is causing all of this. And that's the one thing that Adam and other Zionists cannot admit.